Hi everyone, this is Dr. Martin, and I just wanted to address today how you can ace your oral defense. Some common tips, common questions, that kind of thing. Because a lot of times when you go through your entire thesis or dissertation or capstone, whatever it happens to be, somewhere in the middle or towards the end, you may have to actually orally defend either a proposal or the entire research study. And so it seems very nerve-wracking, right? Well, it's not if you are prepared. So make sure first and foremost that you are indeed prepared by making sure that you have actually designed your study. Make sure you design your presentation based off of the research study that you have. If you have a template from a university, fabulous. You can use that and just fill it out. This may also come from maybe a faculty mentor or dissertation chair, somebody like that. But if you don't have a template, don't worry because your research study is your template. Just simply go to your table of contents, look at all of those headings that you have throughout the entire study, and start building your slides based off of that. Now, keep in mind that most oral defense presentations are only expected to be around 15 to 20 minutes. So you don't want to go overboard with writing content within the presentation. A lot of this might be discussed verbally, and I especially stress this when you're talking about the literature review, because you may have a 20 or 40 page literature review or longer, but you don't want, 100 slides in your presentation because you're only discussing it for 15 to 20 minutes. So you're going to hit the highlights there. The next thing is obviously make sure you read through your presentation. Don't just, throw it together and say, here it is. You need to actually read through it. You need to make sure everything's working for the flow. You also need to practice timing yourself. Again, keep in mind that most presentations are only around that 15 to 20-minute range. Some universities might want a little bit longer, so just check with your university or check with your mentor to see what the specific requirements are for you. But once you have your presentation designed, you've already read through it, you've cleaned it up, and you've practiced your timing by yourself because you want to do that first, then you need to present to an audience. You can find friends, family, colleagues, anybody you can. They don't have to be familiar with your content, and that's the important thing here. They don't need to be, 100% familiar with what you're talking about. You should be able to present your study in a way so that you can relate it to people and you can get them up to speed with what you're talking about. Back when I was doing my dissertation defense a few years back, my dissertation chair had said, write your presentation as if you were going to explain it to your grandmother. And that's a great piece of advice because that's what you're doing. You're designing your presentation so that anyone who is not necessarily familiar with your content or mildly familiar with your content, they're able to understand what you're talking about. Okay, the next part of this is once you've presented in a typical defense format, at the end, you're going to have questions that you have to actually defend your study, hence the oral defense part. So have your audience ask you questions. And keep your responses typically within that 60 to 90-second range, but sometimes you might have to expand a little bit more depending on the actual question. And we'll go over some common questions here in a few moments. Now, if you run into a difficult question, don't worry, don't stress. What I suggest is use a strategy to ask your committee or to ask your mentor or chair to simply restate the question, or if you need to, rephrase the question. This will give you a little bit of think time, if you will, as you're trying to develop your response. The think time is very, very important, but again, don't overthink your questions. Again, your responses are typically in that 60 to 90-second range. I know it feels like, days on end whenever you're having to answer a question, but honestly, time yourself. You'll see that most of your responses fall within that 60 to 90-second range. And lastly here, be confident in your research study. You have to relax. You got all the way up to this point where you're doing the oral defense after having endured the entire process for the written manuscript, which means what you've done along the way, you've had to get approval on that proposal. You had to get approval in the manuscript. Your committee and your chair, your faculty mentor, they know what your research study is. They know it's quality work if you've gotten to this point. So relax, be chill, go through and start working on your presentation skills and be confident in what you've written. Be confident in what you have done. So all of that being said, as just a few general tips whenever you're getting ready for an oral defense, what are some of the kind of like the common questions that you might encounter during that defense? What kind of questions might be asked of you? So the first thing is, can you tell us what your study is all about in just a few sentences? Sounds pretty easy, right? It's actually not as easy as what you might think. You really need to be very familiar with every detail of your research study here to be able to answer this question without getting stuck. And think of this as essentially that 60-second summary of your research study in general. You can also refer back to your abstract or an executive summary, depending on what it's called within your paper. But this is basically the overview of your entire study. What's it all about? Next question you might find is what was your motivation for this study? Now you need to be very careful here. This question is asking you about the research problem, and what you're trying to do with your research study is address that research problem. Your drive for doing that research comes from addressing that problem. So what you're really doing here is you're thinking about why you chose the research problem for your study. You don't want to jump off topic here by stating that this was just a means for graduation or you had financial obligation or something of that nature. You just want to stick to what was the research problem and why did you want to pursue that research problem? All right, next question. How does your study bridge a gap in the literature? Now, this question is actually asking you to justify your study. You will definitely want to point out any gaps that you've identified within the literature, and you want to state very specifically how your study actually addresses those gaps. Another question you might find during an oral defense is, what is the significance of your study? Now, this question is very similar to the previous question. You're still justifying your study. And what you want to really think about here is, what is the importance of your study, and to whom is this study important? This is especially true if you're dealing with an applied research. So you might get a question that is really speaking to your methodology. So what methods or sampling techniques did you employ and why? So this question again is all about that research methodology, and your committee is really wanting to know if you can justify things like your sample size, your sample selection, your data collection methods, etc. So you want to be solid in that category. Next question you might encounter, and this one is a big one, what are your recommendations based on your findings? Now, recommendations are an essential part of any research study, and you should know yours by heart. Your committee is really wanting to know how your results directly address a gap in the literature, how it meets that problem that you addressed earlier on or identified earlier on. They want to know how your results are going to apply to practice. And what your recommendations say is basically your authority on the overall research study. So be confident in your responses here too. A similar question that you might get is, what areas do you suggest for future research? So again, this is similar to the recommendations, but this one's speaking directly to how you foresee research in the future based off of your study. So this is your opportunity to suggest facets for new research. This could be an expansion or a refinement of your current study for a particular purpose, maybe areas you could not explore due to limitations, etc. In essence, the committee is assessing your reasoning and your authority in the research area. Another question that you might see, and this is very typical of applied research studies, is how does your research study impact practice? So again, for some, this might be an easier question to address than others, especially if you're working in an applied research project where the impact of what your results are saying or your recommendations can directly apply to practice. And it could be changes to practice, it could be supporting practice, etc. For more abstract studies, this may be a little bit more difficult to actually address this question. So in general, whenever you get a question that's speaking directly to the impact on practice, these might only really come up in applied research, or if there's a way to directly connect your study with a current practice in the field. So what theories or theoretical framework is your study based on? Okay, so this really should be a freebie kind of question, but believe it or not, people get stuck here. What you're wanting to do is really address the theoretical or conceptual framework that you have within your research study. The committee is simply just trying to assess your understanding of any underlying connections your study has with existing theory. If you were to do it all over again, what would you change? Now, you have to be very, very careful with this question because you don't want to diminish your work, and you definitely don't want to wander in your response. So this question is a way for you to really speak about the limitations of your study and how you would address these limitations should you conduct the study again. Another question that you might get during an oral defense is, what will you do with the findings to make a difference? Now, if you're doing an applied research, again, this might be very easy for you. If you're doing an abstract research, it might be a little more difficult. However, the committee does not want to hear that you just did this research study for graduation purposes. They want to know what you're actually planning to do with your results. Are you planning to impact practice? Are you planning to expand on the research? They don't want to know that you're just going through and saying, yeah, I got the check mark, here I go. All right, next question, and the last one that's a big common question that I'm going to address, is how did the coursework leading up to your study prepare you for the research process? Believe it or not, you couldn't just have started with the research study and called it done. There are a number of influences that prior coursework has had on your writing and your research skills. And so this is really an opportunity for you to express any gratitude that you had for overcoming challenges, building your skill set, and etc. So you're really wanting to praise the program, you're wanting to give some extra support, share your experience, but again, keep it short and sweet. And so this would be where you would finally go through. You did your oral defense presentation. You've successfully, hopefully, gone through those questions. You answered them all on point. And so at this point, you may get any questions that are talking about concluding comments. So you may be asked if you have any final comments, final remarks, etc. This is a good opportunity for you to state any appreciation that you have for those who supported you along the way. This could be family, friends, it could be your committee or specific people on the committee. but you had support along the way, and so you want to do a little recognition for that at this point. After the final remarks, depending on the university procedures, you may be told of the outcome of your oral defense either in person or with a follow-up communication. Either is pretty typical, but at any rate, you made it. You got all the way to the end of your oral defense, so you need to give yourself a pat on the back, congratulate yourself to getting to this point, and relax. Don't stress. If you didn't get a response right away, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just might be procedure. So relax. All right, guys, I hope you found this video helpful. Just going over some of the basics. And yeah, good luck on your defense as you start working towards it.